Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We have an author on who's got a past that really is suitable for the works that he writes, and he brings to the table a conversation that really riveted us for the entirety of it. But what I'm riveted at right now is just knowing how you are. So how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, we speak with Kevin Flynn, who is a former prosecutor, and he's now an author. And he's written a few books. One of them is called Rock Creek, and that is the one that we talk about mostly here today. And that was released in early 2024. And it is about a murder mystery, and it is really a political thriller and a work of historical fiction. And our guest today is a lot of fun to speak with, and I think we had a great conversation.
Yeah, and Kevin really approaches this from the perspective of the time that he spent in the Department of Justice and in D.C. as a prosecutor, and his experience trying almost 30 murder cases and the work that he did to dismantle criminal street gangs. And you can find out more about him on his website, kevinflynnauthor.com. And you can also pick up his other book called Relentless Pursuit, a true story of family murder and the prosecutor who wouldn't quit. And that is a true story.
Yes, and very cool stuff. Kevin was a great interview, and make sure to check out his work.
And Tim, where can people check out our work?
Well, people can follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We're going to take a quick break for commercial, and we'll be right back with author Kevin Flynn. Author Kevin Flynn, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Fine. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We oftentimes get writers on who write about nonfiction crime. You have a nonfiction book. You also have a fiction book, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And it really is in our wheelhouse with the whole noir type genre, which is really cool. But you have a history that goes beyond writing. That is kind of fascinating. Can you tell the listeners where you come from and how you got to this place?
Sure. I grew up I was born in Washington, D.C., and I'm a lifelong resident here. And I was for 35 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Department of Justice in D.C. And unlike in other places that are states, the Federal Prosecutor's Office in D.C. handles local crimes because D.C. isn't a state, and so that's a federal function. And I served as a violent crime prosecutor in D.C. for almost all of that time, handled about 27 murder trials, investigated hundreds more, and was involved in street crime investigation, dismantled several street crimes, not by myself, of course, but in partnership with other prosecutors and with police agencies. And so all of that experience was something which it was directly of benefit in writing my first book, which was called Relentless Pursuit, and was based entirely on a case that I handled back in the 90s, and now Rock Creek, which is a fictionalized version of and loosely based on a case that I handled in the early 2000s, set in 1952 in Washington, D.C.
Real quick, I'm fascinated by the word dismantled when you said that you were part of a team that dismantled street crime. How does that work? Did you go in like undercover or? I
might have used too colorful a term there, but we brought to successful prosecution a number of gangs. Me and myself in partnership with police agencies and other prosecutors. And basically what that means is that we were faced with in 4 or 5 different situations, a series of incidents that we could link to a criminal street gang, and the way that it worked in each of the cases that I was involved with, there were street arrests made first. We then started to develop the case by way of working cooperators from the bottom to the top, and ended up either by way of plea or by way of guilty verdict in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particular instances. Ended up rendering the gang operations moot, taking the players off the street, and rendering, I think, through the court system, appropriate sentences for the people involved. Cooperators who come forward, agree to plead guilty, give truthful information, always ask for and receive benefit from the system because of the truth they told and the risks that they took. And so we would not be able to make cases without working with cooperators. And in each of those situations, we ended up having to do so. And one that I'm actually particularly pleased about and proud of is that there was a gang that was terrorizing a neighborhood in D.C. called Columbia Heights in the early 2000s. And there were actually two gangs that were at war with each other. And we ended up prosecuting 13 of the members of the more violent of the two gangs. And it wasn't long after that the crime dropped precipitously in that area. The area started to build back and recover, and normal people, normal everyday folks who were law abiding and peace abiding were able to go about their lives, and businesses started up. And so you saw, I saw in real time the impact that that our law enforcement efforts could have on bettering the lives of the people in a particular area.
It's amazing. Well done.
Yeah, really interesting. And of course, you worked on the Chandra Levy case as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your work on that case?
Sure. I always have emphasized that Rock Creek is inspired by and not based on the Levy case. I worked on that case from 2002 to 2006. In 2001, Ms. Levy went missing, and as you are probably aware, the public it's still in the public knowledge that a congressman was a suspect in that case. Ms. Levy's body was found in 2002. At that point, I became involved in the case, supervising its investigation, but also involved on a hands-on basis day to day. And in between 2002 and 2006, we developed significant leads that resulted in our believing that we had a solid suspect, but we did not have enough evidence to prosecute or to have that person placed under arrest. I left the case in 2006 to go on sabbatical that was family related between 2006 and 2009. And in the meantime, in 2006 to 2009, I began writing this book, Rock Creek. Returned to my office in 2009 and informed the management that I would not be able to return to the case because I would have what's called a conflict of interest. In other words, there would be an appearance that I would have an interest in potentially having the case be resolve itself in a certain way because it might be able to financially benefit me in the novel that I was working on. That's a process called recusal, which you might be familiar with, and it's not right now. It's not being observed possibly in situations where it should be, but that's another subject entirely. So the Levy case was a case that inspired this, and for reasons that I can go into, I ended up having to take substantial creative liberties with the case so as to make sure that it was distinguished from the actual true life case, because I had gotten to know the Levy family well, and I didn't want there to be any hint that I was doing anything that would exploit that case or their daughter's tragic death.
So going into the writing of this novel, did you know that you were going to have that conflict of interest, or was that something that happened as you were, a few chapters in?
Yeah, I toyed with not going back to work. I had taken the sabbatical because my hours had just gotten crazy and my kids were still of an age that I wanted to spend more time with them. So when I first started writing the book, I was toying with the idea of just being a stay-at-home dad for the rest of my time. And so when I first started writing it, I wasn't writing it with the idea that I might end up having a conflict. But I did inevitably go back to the office, and as soon as I went back, I realized that would be a matter that even though I would want to rejoin it, that I wouldn't be able to because of that issue.
In having written nonfiction and fiction, do you find it to be true that you can't make things up that are stranger than real life?
I don't know if I found when I was writing Rock Creek that I felt very much liberated from having to deal with a like a factual narrative. Nonfiction is I think any writing is difficult. It's very it's rewarding, especially when you write something that you're pleased with, and you bring it to the public, and you believe it might educate or elucidate the public, or entertain, or somehow inspire. The writing of it is difficult. Nonfiction I found easier, though, in the sense that I had a true life narrative that I could adhere to, and that particular book, Relentless Pursuit, was about a really horrific homicide, double homicide, that was perpetrated by the defendant against a mother and daughter, where their bodies were despicably mutilated, and so that was I had a baseline going into the writing of Rock Creek of, for lack of a better term, human depravity, that couldn't be exceeded by fiction. But once I got involved in writing Rock Creek, I ended up really being liberated by not having to sort of stick to something that I was remembering as opposed to something that I was imagining. So, for example, when I first sat down to think about a second writing project, my agent for the first book, Relentless Pursuit, asked me what's your next book going to be about, and I felt like saying, well, it took me a long time to publish this one. Don't rush me. But then he was saying, have you been involved in any high-profile cases that you could write about? And I said, I referenced the Levy case, but I said I can't write about it right now because first, everything I know is secret because it was all in the grand jury and it was all confidential. And second, I didn't want to do anything that would embarrass or seem to exploit the Levy family. And in the course of 2 minutes, the rest of my creative life up until this point was sort of governed because, or set out before me, because we decided that I could fictionalize it. And I didn't want to fictionalize it in the time of the 2000s. I wanted to fictionalize it in a historical period. So I just took the book back 50 years. And so the book starts literally 50 years to the day from when Ms. Levy's body was found in 2002. So that's how it went back to 1952. There really wasn't anything more to it than just, I'm going to set it back. I got to set it back a certain amount of time. I might as well set it back 50 years. And from there were a lot of creative choices that opened up to me. I didn't want the book in any way to feature a character whose background or life paralleled that of the real Chandra Levy. And I had to create a backstory for her. And so reasoning backwards from 1952, I was trying to figure out what this character would be all about and what would make her compelling. Came across a Washington Post or New York Times article from the late 40s about these two sisters who were Holocaust survivors, had gone from Germany to Shanghai, then been taken out of a camp in Shanghai, or came back to New York, and I thought, bingo, that's my main victim. My main victim has a past rooted in tragedy, and just took it from there. And it so happened that I knew something about 1952. I didn't think about this at the time, specifically when I started writing it, but my parents met in D.C. in June of 1952. I had a lot of pictures available to me. I had a lot of sort of family knowledge about the time, and so I as soon as I sort of settled myself into that era, I was very comfortable with it moving forward.
Yeah, it's a very rich period of time, right? There's a lot of social issues. There's a lot of political stuff going on. How did you kind of weave all that into your story?
Well, I hope I did it well. I didn't do it well at first. The first draft of this was too long, and the plot lines were not particularly. It was a very complicated narrative, and I hope that I over time honed it to the point where the various storylines mesh and they relate well with each other. I started researching this in fall of 2007 into early 2008. So the book took a long time through a number of drafts to come to publication. But as soon as I got into researching the history of the period, I realized two things. One, if you're writing a historical work, historical fiction, with all the internet sources available now, there is really no excuse to get anything wrong. And so I delved deep into the period, and I thought when I started out that I was going to be in libraries going through microfiche, and in fact found out that all of the Washington Post, for example, going back to the early 1900s are available online. And so I took several months just basically going through day by day what was going on during various times when these events, my fictional events, would have been taking place. I created files for 90 some homicides that occurred during that period. And so following those cases through, because I wanted to make sure that I could see where cases went from start to finish through from the arrest process through the court process. And I also I got much more of a window than I had before into the various political issues and geopolitical issues that were important and significant at the time, and very much focused on race and the effect that race was an issue in 1952, just as it was an issue in 2002, just as it's an issue in 2024, and in fact was amazed, not particularly amazed, but it was interesting to see how virulent racism was in 1952, much more so than now, and particularly with regards to the interactions between law enforcement and members of the Black community. And if I could just expand on that just for a moment, one of the things which made this particular location so fascinating to me was that Rock Creek Park is a local treasure, but it's not really well known outside of Washington, D.C. It is a park. It's actually one of the biggest urban parks in the country in terms of a park which sits almost entirely within a city's limits. And unlike Central Park in New York and certain other parks, Grant Park in Chicago, other parks, Rock Creek Park is wild in the middle of it. You could walk 10 minutes into Rock Creek Park, and it is as if you are 50 miles from a city. And it's beautiful. It's untamed. It's protected. It's part of the National Park Service. But it also had two pieces of significance historically that were very resonant to me. One is that in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, and even up to the time of Chandra Levy, it was a notorious dumping ground for females who had been killed. Now, I went back historically and I saw a number of cases, most of which were unsolved, in which women were found dead in the park. It was as beautiful as the park is, and as untamed as it is. It's also a natural setting for someone who's up to no good to want to dump something or conceal something or get rid of something, such as the body of a victim. And the other thing that was fascinating about Rock Creek Park to me was that it was a dividing line between the black and the white parts of the city. If you're familiar with D.C., Georgetown, Embassy Row is a very affluent area. Georgetown is a very affluent area. The most affluent areas of the city now and as then were west of Rock Creek Park. Back then, the east of the park was less developed and more dominated by a black population. And so the park literally, it divided black and white to the point where if a black person walked across strayed too far east of the park, they would literally get a ticket from the police. And if you had 3 tickets, you get thrown in jail. So the police department at the time, not now, but at the time was very racially backwards. That place, Rock Creek Park, really symbolized racial division to me, and also how something that is very beautiful can also be haunting and a place of potential danger. And all those elements mixed together were something that I thought I might be able to make something out of in terms of writing a mystery thriller that would also be a compelling piece of historical narrative.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And can you discuss some of the characters in your book and how maybe your professional encounters with certain criminal organizations may have impacted some of the characters?
Sure. I knew when I started writing the book that I wanted the characters to be full-bodied. I had never written fiction before I started, writing Rock Creek. I had written, a nonfiction book, and I had done a lot of legal writing over time, but I had never written fiction. And I literally was buying books about how to write fiction. But I knew from my background, one thing that I had an advantage in was creating characters that were full-bodied because of the various types of folks that I had met and encountered over my years of my job. And so the police detective, Shane Kinnick, he's the protagonist in the case. He is loosely based on a good friend of mine who was a homicide detective, whose father was a congressman. This detective worked homicide cases, violent crime cases for years, knew D.C. streets like the back of his hand. And I always thought that he would make an interesting prototype for a character, even before I sat down to write Rock Creek. But he is as steady as the day is long, a very solid guy, great family man. I knew that the guy that I wanted to write about, given the time period, 1952, he would most likely have been through the war, and everyone, I maintain, millions of people who went through World War II were scarred by it in ways that it wasn't commonly fashionable to talk about at the time. My father was in the war, and he was one of the classic people who never talked about it, and he didn't even see combat. So I knew that Shane had to be a more conflicted, compromised, and tormented person than my friend in real life. But I also knew that if I was going to spend time with a protagonist, it had to be somebody who at the end of the day, as tormented as he is by all kinds of demons, he had to be somebody who is a good guy trying to do the right thing in the criminal justice system, and that's how I wanted him to be. And I don't want to give away any endings here, but I think any reader of the book starting out can more or less count on the fact that this guy is not going to end up being a killer himself, and he's not going to end up being a monster. Other characters, as I say, I was very much committed to having each character not only be revealed through the course of each chapter, but to have an arc over the course of the story. And those kind of arcs were informed by the sort of arcs that I watched in real life as a prosecutor be followed by, for example, criminal defendants that I dealt with. In prosecuting, as I said before, prosecuting gang members, I worked closely with cooperating witnesses. These are people who were charged with either having firsthand committed violent crimes or being violent crime conspirators. One of the cooperators who I spent the most time with in the gang case from the early 2000s, the Columbia Heights gang case, was someone who had actually been involved in a baseball bat murder, physically, with the bat in his hands, in a homicide. I spent hours and hours with him, got to know everything about how he got to the States, how he got into a gang, how he became involved, how he became an alcoholic, how that alcoholism fueled his violence, and how ultimately he came to grips with what he had done, how he came to grips with the risk that he was going to take to come forward and testify against members of his own family who were in this gang, and how he followed the arc all the way through to following the service of a prison sentence, developing a life of his own with a family, working person. I could give you his name. The name is a matter of public record, but he was in witness protection, so he doesn't go by the same identity. And he still, up until my last day at the office last year, he would still call me every 6 months or so to check in and make sure that I knew that he was doing okay. And my line that I always said to him every single time was, you're living for two. Just know for the rest of your life that you're living for two. And he and I both knew that meant that he had to be living with the spirit of the person who he had been involved in murdering with him, and that had to drive him. And he told me that it drove him to be a better person every day. So when you encounter those kinds of people in your job, it makes it much easier to actually sit down and create characters that are not all good or not all bad. And I came across a line recently that I thought was interesting in terms of the process that I went through, and that is a line from an Irish poet that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And I lived that life for a number of years, and so I was able to sit down and create characters that were more full-bodied and more three-dimensional than I think a writer who is more skilled than I am possibly would be able to if they hadn't lived the kind of life I was able to lead professionally. I also was able to have in Rock Creek. Rock Creek is very much centered in a place, and that's Washington D.C. And I know D.C., the D.C. of the modern day D.C. very well. But I also I have a deep affinity for it, and so it was easy for me to write about that place with love and respect, and to convey that to, I hope, to readers as well.
Yeah, really fascinating there, because you're taking these characters that you've met, real life characters that you've met in your own life, in your own professional work outside of writing, and you're molding them into one or more characters in your narrative in Rock Creek. And I'm wondering if that's something that is sort of like a role that you think books like Rock Creek should be taking on, especially if you're writing about a period of time that I mean, it's half a century ago, right? It's like more than half a century ago. There's no social media. There's, a lot of like secrecy and a lot of like closed lip that, behavior that happens around racism and PTSD. And you kind of touched on that. So is that like the role that you think a book like Rock Creek needs to take on?
I think it's a role that it does take on. And I didn't realize really how resonant it is with modern times until I was engaged in a rewrite back during COVID. I was working with an editor. I had one editor who I worked with toward the end of the process. I had done all my own edits up until working with an editor at the very end, and we were basically going back through the entire narrative, I was the day that George Floyd was killed. Earlier that day, I was in Rock Creek Park with my family doing some background research for the last few chapters of the book, which are flashback chapters, and went back over the days to come, was following the news, and I saw how many things that are very prevalent in Rock Creek are prevalent today. There is police misconduct in Rock Creek. There is a black male who's charged suspiciously and under shaky circumstances with the murder of the victim in the case, whose name is Emily. There were protests that arose from his arrest and his impending trial. All of those things were things that actually did not necessarily happen per se in 1952. There weren't protests that in the real life 1952. There were not protests that grew out of an arrest of a black male under these circumstances. But this is where history and historical fiction sort of diverge. And in my role as a fiction writer, I could posit that under the right circumstances, with the right set of people in place in 1952, this sort of thing could have happened. There could have been a religious figure, as there is in Rock Creek, who generates a protest, and if that protest develops momentum, and that protest is something that is influential in terms of what happens for the rest of the book. Any piece of historical fiction, I think, can serve the role of serving as a reminder to us that we might be better than we were in the past, but we're still not there yet. And the fact that this is not in the book, but it came out in my research. In 1951, there was still in the Washington Post a division of the classified ads in the rental page, in the rental ads, between units up for rent by whites and units up for rent to quote unquote coloreds. That is not that long ago, really. That is within the lifespan of millions of people, including it predates me but not by all that much. And it's still in our parents' or older aunts and uncles' generation time period, and it's still, for example, I'm sure that sort of experience or that knowledge shapes the president who was born about, I think he was born a few years before that. But all historical fiction, I think, can serve that function. Whether it aspires to or not, that's a different story. But I do think that if people read Rock Creek, they will see that. They will think to themselves, wow, things were really bad then, but also, wow, they aren't perfect now, and we can do better.
And how long did it take you to write Rock Creek?
I guess the short answer is a year, and the long answer is 15. The first draft took me a year, And this was a time when, as I said, I was on family leave. My wife had been part-time for years, and I had been full-time. Decided that I wanted to switch the roles, give her a chance to go full-time, and I wanted to be part-time, and then just went full off for, I thought it was going to be a year. It turned into 3 years. So I had a time during the day when the kids were at school to block out to write this. And then I was able to use that time to put it to good use, at least in terms of coming up with the first draft. But the first draft was too long, and it was, as I said, it didn't tie together all of the various strands that are in this story. So I literally I went through 5 more drafts while I was working, and while I was still, my kids were going through adolescence, through up to going away to college, and now they both live in New York. They're both lawyers, but with all that going on, plus a full-time job, I was going through ultimately 5 different edits. It's easy to edit, by the way, when you're working full-time, because you can piece in editing without having to sit down and re-gear writing creatively. I was able to piece in edit time really easily. I would call my wife, hey, what's going on with the kids? Well, they're still doing their homework. Okay, I'll stop off at a place on the way home. I stopped off my go-to place was a bar not far from my house, which I found really conducive to work because it was white noise and I could have a beer and sit down with with the book. And then finally had it in shape to put out to publishers in 2021 after working with an editor. This is the sordid part of the story. Got a publisher, had a terrible experience with the publisher, had to get my rights back from the publisher, and now it's being published by an independent press called Kilimanjaro Press. So it was a lot of work went into it, but it was a labor of love, very much so.
That must have been a really stressful time to have this be your property that you created, and it was sort of taken. Can you expand on that? How did that happen with the first publisher?
I don't want to get into too many details. It was an independent publisher. I believe money issues may have gotten away, but they went ghost on me in early 2022. I was supposed to have a publication date of April 27, 2023, or thereabouts. Started having bad communications with them in early 2023. I don't want to get into much more detail than that, but it ended up to the point where lawyers had to get involved, and it was a many month-long process where I to get rights back. And as anybody who's written a book or knows someone who's written a book knows, if you don't have your rights as an author, you don't have anything. And so I finally got rights back, and that was one of the best days of my life outside of some family triumph. It was it's taken a long course to get where it is, but I'm really proud of it, and really pleased that it's in the public, and I'm getting to sit down and talk with folks like you.
And as far as the social commentary that is part of the book, has that always been in the fabric of your being? I mean, were you raised to identify people as all equal, and was that part of your upbringing? Did you use some of that in the book?
It was part of my upbringing. And I'll get to that in just a second, but none of the characters who are close to the lead character, Shane, are based on anyone in my personal life, either my parents or my wife or my kids. When I sat down to write this, I decided that it would be unfair, really, to write even in positive terms about to have, for example, have Shane connect the lead character, have a nice, solid, steady, loving marriage, or to have his kids parallel my kids, or in any way like that, because that makes people uncomfortable. I think if they know someone who's written a book and then they're looking for themselves in it, and no matter how positively you write about somebody, sometimes, I mean, if it's too positive, it's not going to be interesting, right? So Shane does not have a functional relationship during the book. It was an act of imagination for me to write that. I found liberated as a writer. not having to parallel real life, and actually put himself in a place where he was not where I was while I was writing it, and he's not where I am now. Shane has a very strained relationship with his father. I had a very good relationship with both my parents, and I have a great relationship with my kids. So my upbringing isn't a part of the book in terms of the people that were around me when I was growing up. I had people in my family when I was growing up who I knew to be, even when I was a kid, I knew to be racially insensitive, and that's a bit of a euphemism. But I was raised that no matter what I saw among folks in my family, that I should be different, and I should grow up with ideals that were higher than the ones that the older generations had, and so growing up in D.C. Well, I actually grew up in Annandale, which is Virginia suburb outside of D.C., but it's 15 minutes outside of D.C. And I was in D.C. every weekend visiting my grandparents, and so I remember I'm old enough to remember hearing about the March on Washington and the "I Have a Dream" speech. I lived through the assassination of Martin Luther King, the riots that happened in D.C. in the days following. I knew about race from the time that I was first aware, and I knew which side of that divide I knew what side of the divide I was on by way of complexion, and I knew which side of the divide I should be on by way of attitude. And so I'm not perfect, and I don't think anyone is, but I was raised to I was raised with it very much deeply to be a part of me that that racial intolerance was wrong, and that I should strive to do anything I could to sort of right those wrongs. And one of the reasons, as a prosecutor, I had two roles, and it's a complex road I'm going to be going down here conversationally, but I was prosecuting 98% of the defendants that I prosecuted were African American. 98% of the victims whose cases that I was representing for the government were African American, and so I was very so from the time that I was 30 years old when I started in the job, and that introduced me to a layer of racial interaction and a sort of a milieu that was sort of fraught with tension and stress than any that I had previously encountered. But I do hope that I missed the job a lot, and I do hope that I was on the right side many more times than on the wrong side.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And throughout your career and literary journey, what profound lesson about human nature has impacted you the most?
I think I would have to say that nobody is all bad and nobody's all good. I think there is a core of goodness in the heart of just about everybody. I can only think of two of my defendants that I prosecuted over the years who I have a hard time believing that there was real good in them, and that sounds terrible to say, but when you counterbalance that against the many defendants that I encountered, some of whom very closely, and some of whom had been charged with and had actually done terrible things, but were on the path to redemption. I came to see that and developed more and more of an understanding of the complexities of human nature. I also, on the flip side, I developed a real, sad to say, by firsthand experience, a sense that not all the heroes are heroic. I was disappointed by law enforcement officers and other prosecutors at times who acquitted themselves in ways that were either unethical or at least improper, and in fact almost had my career derailed because I was involved in a case in which a homicide detective, unbeknownst to me, perjured himself on the witness stand in a homicide case, and it resulted in the case having to be dismissed, and I was more or less put in the position of being a whistleblower, and suffered some career consequences until the U.S. attorney, a new U.S. attorney, came into the job, and made things right for me. And interestingly, that new U.S. attorney was Eric Holder, the future Attorney General. He became U.S. Attorney in 1993 in D.C., which is the top job in the U.S. Attorney's office. And I presented my case to him, and at least my career path was righted. But that experience in particular was one which was deeply disheartening to me, because I had faith in this detective, and at other times have been disappointed by, and have actually had to take action in connection with misconduct perpetrated by police or by prosecutors. On more than one occasion, I had to be involved in dismissing cases based on either police misconduct or police malfeasance or police nonfeasance. And so I'm sort of deeply familiar with how not everybody who has the white hat is actually the good guy. So that's one lesson I take from it. And the other is something which is a little bit more complicated, I guess, but that is that I found over the years that nobody ever does anything for just one reason. Everybody has at least two reasons for doing anything. When Mother Teresa got up every morning and aided the incredibly impoverished in India, I guarantee you that when she went to bed at night, in some small part of her head, she's thinking to herself, I feel good about myself for what I did today. So it's, and getting to those motivations was a big part of my job. Why somebody does something, and piecing together cases a lot of times just results in incrementally, piece by piece by piece. Why did they do this? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? Why did this happen? And that exercise, circling back to an earlier question that you all had, that exercise helped me in writing this book from the past forward. The reader reads it from the present backwards. In other words, the reader is confronted with a skull and a story which pieces together how that skull ended up where it was in Rock Creek Park, and who was responsible for the murder. And the reader is going backwards. I had to go backwards forward, because I had to be thinking, who would have done this? How would they have done it? And then move forward like that. And so working that process through in terms of the motivations of the character was enormously benefited by the kind of intellectual exercise I had to go through in investigating a case.
Wow. I think that you just sort of described your next book. I mean, the process that you went through and your insight into these characters and what you took from your professional life into this could be a book on its own. I mean, that is incredibly fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I really, really welcome an opportunity like this to talk to folks about such as yourself and your audience about the creative process, because it's something that I wasn't completely aware of just what a process fiction writing is until I got into it, and then having to sort of go through it, especially and doing the number of drafts I did over the number of years and working with people on it. It is a fascinating process, and no writer there is no one particular way of doing it. Some writers construct an entire book in advance and outline everything and rigidly stick to that. And one thing that I found in the course of writing this, I wrote about the first 5 or 6 chapters, outlined them all, and then I realized the characters were just going off on their own. I was sort of catching up to the characters to some extent, and even just describing that process, that even that kernel of what the process is all about to folks like yourselves is really energizing for me.
Well, thanks a lot. And this has been a great conversation. Where is the best place for our listeners to get your book?
My author website is kevinflynnauthor.com, and that has links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Also, the book can be found just by way of running Rock Creek Kevin Flynn on through Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I think it's on a crazy number of retail sites. That's if I have a second. One of the things that is fascinating about putting a book out is once it goes out everywhere. And this book appeared on 4 sites that were overseas, that are international sites, before it appeared on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And so it literally, I saw it pop up on something called Rakuten, which I wasn't familiar with what that is. It is the Amazon of Japan. So I'm not going to direct your audience to Rakuten, but Amazon and Barnes and Noble are certainly outlets that it's available on. And if you any people in your audience want to find out more about me, the book, the process, my author's website has that, and there's also a contact tab. Anyone who wants to get in touch with me by way of email can get in touch by way of kevinflynnauthor.com.
So what is next for you? Do you have another book in the works? Are you researching something?
I do. I have 100 pages of notes for the next book and 100 ideas, which means that functionally I have no ideas. I'm looking to take the same character into either the late 50s or into the 60s. When I originally set out on this venture, I thought, well, I might end up having a trilogy in me here. I could take the same character through DC in the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s, and have his path chart the path of the city as these various issues were handled in the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s. The fact that it took me 17 years to get the first chapter out doesn't necessarily bode well for like there being a Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter type series in the works. But I'm looking to take the same character into the 50s or 60s. One case that I'm really focused on as being a potential, it's a real life case, but a potential good springboard for a piece of historical fiction. There was a case a murder case happened in 1964. Mary Meyer was a mistress of JFK. She was mysteriously murdered in Georgetown. The case was closed by way of an arrest. The arrest was of a black male who had been seen in the vicinity. The evidence was flimsy. He was acquitted. Fortunately, the case has never been solved, and she was someone who was not only a former mistress of JFK, but she was also someone who was very connected with intelligence circles. And she was killed in Georgetown, in this very picturesque area in Georgetown, and that seems to be a case that would be rife with potential facts and circumstances and fruitful for potential historical fictional development. But I'm a ways off from being able to bring that to fruition.
Well, when it's ready, you're welcome to come back on the show to talk about that book. And also, you're more than welcome to come back on to talk about anything that could provide insight into the legal system and anything that we would tend to cover here on this show that I think our listeners have questions about. I feel like you'd be a good expert witness.
I would love to come back anytime. It's been a blast talking with you guys, and I'll tell you a quick story. We do the glamorous work of being a prosecutor is in trial, is in front of trial juries, and anybody who's been watching the news knows about all the high profile trials that are going on right now. But the heart and soul of being a prosecutor is working in grand jury, because that's where we're investigating cases. Anybody in D.C., as in most other jurisdictions, who is charged with a felony has a right to have their case heard by a grand jury. Grand juries in D.C. sit 23 people at a time. They sit in secret, and we put cases into them every single day, and we're working hand in hand with them. And the point I'm going to be making here is that I looked at the grand jury process as, well, first, it's very interactive, and so grand jurors can ask questions which trial juries can't. They can just interrupt the witness. They can start asking questions. They ask questions of us. It is a great window into the community and into what folks are really thinking about, not just a case, but about issues in general, because what people's general feelings are about things are reflected by their questions. But it was also a way for me to educate them. And I looked at that opportunity as, I'm getting 23 citizens of the District of Columbia into a room that I can spend hours with at a time. And I want them to leave the experience after they've done their term, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, where they feel better about the criminal justice system. And they know that we're trying to do our best to do the right thing. So any kind of opportunity that I have to talk with folks like you all, with an audience like you have, I'll be back in a second.
Cool. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Best of luck with your book.
Thank you again for having me. It's been really energizing.